Great, so I'm also talking about climate change. So I'm really pleased to be here. I work with Dr. Chris Carlston, who's the director of the Legacy for Airway Health, and he wanted to be here today to help to present this as well. But I have the privilege of talking to you all about climate change and potential impacts in general, but also on patients living with COPD. So we'll talk about the exposures that we can expect and what's changing in our world with climate change, and talk about susceptibility that may be unique in patients who are living with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. We'll also talk about some initiatives in BC and beyond to try to help and try to get information out there, and then practical considerations around preparing and acting and resources for readiness and advocacy as well. So air pollution is important now, right? Climate change is not in the future, climate change is occurring now. And there are a few studies that demonstrate predictions surrounding how much air pollution is related to current morbidity and mortality globally. And we know that there are about hundreds of thousands of millions of patients are unfortunately dying of air pollution presently, and this is unfortunately expected if pollution levels to increase. And this may be in some populations an even more detrimental exposure than cigarette smoke. One of the main components of air pollution, and something you may have seen in some weather reports, is something called particulate matter. So air pollution is complex. It contains a number of different chemicals, things like ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and a number of different agents. But one of the ones that we focus on the most is PM 2.5 and PM 10. PM stands for particulate matter. The reason why I'm showing this picture from the US EPA is that size is incredibly important in terms of the health effects of particulate matter. And in fact, how we name particulate matter is dependent on size. So PM10 is anything that's less than 10 microns in diameter. It's shown here in blue. It includes things like dust, pollen, and mold. It is about 1/5 the size of a human hair. PM 2.5 is in red here. It's about 1/4 the size of a PM10 molecule and below. Contains things like combustion particles, organic compounds, metals, and so forth. And then there are very, very small molecules, about 1/25 the size of PM 2.5 and below, called nanoparticles. Those are important because we can't measure those like we measure other kinds of particulate matter, but because they're so small, they have a really large surface area and they can hold on to a bunch of chemicals as well. PM10 and PM 2.5 are monitored by government agencies, and there are reports that are given out with weather reports, PM 2.5 specifically, that you can see. The smaller the size, the more deeply these penetrate into the lung. So PM10 tends to deposit in the upper airway. PM 2.5 goes deeper down into the airways and out to the alveoli. And the nanoparticles, can actually translocate all the way into the bloodstream. And these molecules are incredibly impactful in terms of activating the immune system and causing those things like inflammation and oxidative stress, which are processes that are already going on in patients with COPD. And indeed, these particles are causally related to morbidity, mortality, and individuals with COPD have heightened susceptibility to these. These are PM levels seen in Vancouver. So these are slides from August of 2018. You can see on the left-hand side PM 2.5 of 122, which is quite high. WHO standards right now are less than 5 for health. 5. And PM 10 levels of 147. And this is in the setting of wildfire smoke. And on the right-hand side, within 5 days, those levels have dropped dramatically to 7.6 and 23. But we are experiencing the effects summer after summer of these incredibly high spikes in PM 2.5 and PM 10, which are disproportionately impacting patients with underlying lung disease, including COPD, and are a direct result of climate change and contributing to climate change. We know that climate change in terms of weather is happening now as well. I mean, all it takes is listening to the weather reports and really living through it here in Vancouver. And I think that we here in Vancouver and the rest of British Columbia, we see these effects more than quite often. I very recently moved to Vancouver about a year ago, and I would say the effects out here are quite tangible compared with many other places. Thinking about things like atmospheric rivers, which I'd never even heard of before, but it's quite impactful in the wildfires. But these are becoming more and more, the impacts of climate change and things like wildfires and flooding and changes in heat, extreme swings in temperature are rising to the level of national coverage more and more frequently. And indeed, professional journals and societies are starting to cover this more and more in the literature. We understand through modeling that these effects and these impacts and these weather changes are increasing with time as the planet continues to warm. And we know that individuals with COPD who already have underlying inflammation and oxidative stress are more sensitive to changes in temperature in the surrounding environment. And then things like floods and other changes may directly impact exposure to other pathogens, as well as background resources to deal with just sort of day-to-day activities with COPD. Some of the changes that we will see, and that may not be on everybody's radar, are changes within the pollen seasons. And so it's expected, as our planet warms, that we start to see more pollen and more intense pollen seasons, as well as longer pollen seasons. In part, this is due to increased carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide in the atmosphere, which contributes to greater development of pollen within plants. And then the longer warming season, too, allows this pollen to remain around for more. So for individuals who have allergies, including many individuals with COPD, this is something that we are thinking about, certainly as providers and patients. We also know that in terms of exacerbations, these temperature swings are important. So ambient temperature, ambient means outdoor. We know that higher temperatures and lower temperatures can contribute to increased risk of exacerbations in patients with COPD. And this is shown in several very, very large studies and is accepted. But furthermore, there's growing evidence, and I think this is still under investigation, that the combined impacts of higher levels of air pollution, in addition to higher temperatures or even lower temperatures in some cases, may have synergistic effects. So we may see worse outcomes or higher rates of exacerbations than either alone. And I want to go back to this slide, because remember how complex these interactions are for the lung and how much we think about this, particularly in individuals with COPD, and all those factors on the left-hand side, and the context of those within climate change. So zooming in on those, with climate change, thinking about more extreme weather events on the bottom, thinking about wildfires, thinking about higher storms, thinking about rain and flooding and so forth, and the infrastructure that's needed to rebuff against that, as well as the complex needs of patients who are living with COPD, including access to medications, sometimes oxygen, needs for electricity, for nebulizers and so forth, and how disruptions due to weather can really make some of those things more challenging and more difficult. Also thinking about the change in pollen, shown again on the right, but how we know that something called vector ecology is very likely to change in the setting of climate change. With warmer seasons elongating, we may see differential migration of animals that carry viruses and carry disease and so forth. So what we are exposed to may change over time. We also know that exposure to air pollution can have long-term changes on DNA and on our genetics and which genes are expressed. We know that this is going to impact our families, our social structures, our community, our ability to engage, and really we need to form connections in order to rebuff this more strongly than ever. We need to make changes in infrastructure, and we will have some changes in infrastructure as a result of climate change. And certainly we know that climate change has economic impacts in terms of cost as well. So all these things are going to change in the setting of our changing environment. And there's a lot of attention to this. So for those who have not heard, COP27, which is an international conference, is actually going on right now. And this is looking at adherence to the climate acts and agreements that were made to try to reduce particulate matter and other pollutants in the atmosphere and try to reduce global warming down to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and how different countries are adhering to that. So this is, of course, being discussed at a very, very high level. But it's also being discussed locally. quite a bit. And there's a number of actions that BC Lung, as well as University of British Columbia and the Government of Canada are doing to try to address climate change. And in the context of knowing that climate change is happening, what can we do to protect individuals who are living through climate change and who may be uniquely susceptible? So this is a collaborative called HEAL, Climate Change, Health Effects, Adaptation and Resilience, that is formed and supported through the University of British Columbia, which brings together a large number of resources to try to understand and provide impetus and make change in terms of adaptations that are protective for individuals living through climate change. The first theme is really to understand in detail how extreme weather events lead to adverse health outcomes. And really understanding the full extent of the problem is one of the first steps in trying to provide solutions. At the same time, trying to identify and design strategies to minimize impact. So the idea of working together to adapt for protection and prevention, and to really comprehensively understand all the threats and stressors that we are facing and that individuals who are more susceptible are facing, to put structures in place in advance of continued changes in our climate. And lastly, to implement and evaluate developed strategies. So once we completely understand the problem, and even now where we have a great sense of the problem and are starting to come up with some solutions and some protective factors, how do we work with individuals? How do we work with stakeholders? How do we work with government, health authorities, universities, and the people who are living through this to try to make change, and then try to understand the impact of that change and move forward and continue to improve? So BC is doing a lot, I will say. I think one thing that you can do individually as patients, and I try to do as a provider with my patients, is make sure that you know what resources are out there and you know what's going on in your environment, because it's hard to protect yourself if you just don't know what's going on, if you don't know what the air quality is. And certainly we have days where you can look outside and you can see that there's quite a bit of smoke and you know that that's not good, but there are days where the air quality can still be poor and you may not be able to see it. So how do you protect yourself in advance? The Government of Canada has something known as the Air Quality Health Index. It's measured on a scale of 1 to 10, and it takes into account several of the pollutants, which I mentioned earlier, including that PM 2.5 and ozone and NO2, and it creates a scale that tells you essentially the risk of the air outside to an individual. And this is available through BC government websites. There's a number of access points, but it's also available on many of just the weather applications that you may have. And if you're having difficulty finding it, the 811 should have this information as well, but you should be able to see this on news stations and so forth. And then the BC CDC has put out a number of recommendations for what individuals and what actions you can take in the setting of these differential rankings of the Air Quality Health Index. And you'll see all the way on the left-hand side, there's also, in areas where the Air Quality Health Index is not available, PM 2.5 levels as well, which is one of those pollutants I spent some time talking about. So that's another index to look at. And then on the right-hand side, there are health messages for people at higher risk. And I would say that individuals who are diagnosed with COPD count within that population at higher risk. So it makes sense to sort of follow those guidelines and then work with your provider to individualize those guidelines as well. And indeed, many resources are available through BC, both the BC CDC, and then there are links to info sheets put out by the BC CDC on the BC Lung Foundation website. And I pulled this from some information that's put out about wildfire smoke and lung health. And down below, you can see there's a whole bunch of writing in blue, but each of those is a separate info sheet that you can use to educate yourself about effects of wildfire smoke, what to do in preparation for wildfire season, and how strategies to help best protect yourself. Talking about portable air cleaners, because there's a lot out there, and knowing which one to buy and which type to buy can be really confusing, but they've tried to put these in to 1 or 2 pagers. And really opportunities to educate yourself about what's out there. And then things to bring with questions to your providers and really elevate the conversation and try to get some personalized advice. And indeed, we're working on a project right now with Legacy for Airway Health to try to provide a communication tool that integrates some of that evidence for not only for wildfire smoke in those info sheets, but also evidence that's out there surrounding temperature that empowers providers to have these conversations and give a personalized sheet with information out to patients who are living with COPD and asthma. And this is under testing right now. But again, this is just a potential communication tool to talk about all the information that's already out there and try to consolidate it and personalize it. So we're testing this. We're going to see if this is effective, beneficial, feasible to do within provider visits and so forth. And then hopefully if it is, we'll be trying to roll that out. I also wanted to highlight a program which I think is, maybe you all know about, but I found pretty amazing, is that air conditioners and air cleaners are actually deductible medical expenses if you get a prescription from your doctor and qualify as more severe disease. So this is from, this is recent, I promise you, it's from the Revenue Agency, Canada Revenue Agency. And indeed, these are the conditions. So if you get a prescription from your provider and you're considered to have a severe chronic ailment, disease, or disorder, which I would argue COPD would qualify in the setting of susceptibility, you can get a reduced price on an air conditioner or tax rebates, really, and tax rebate for air filters, air cleaners, or air purifiers, which are some of the ways to mitigate exposure in the indoor environment, especially when we can't control the outdoor environment as much. You can control what's happening indoors. And then I think it's important, the more we discuss this and the more we ask providers about this and the more we talk in our community about this, the more that individuals sort of rise to action and try to come up with solutions. So I have a colleague who works for advocacy in the US, and he gives a really great sort of paragraph about how to go out and start to do this. But what he recommends is really, if you are in a building association, if you are at a town hall meeting, if you are working with any organization or are affiliated with any organization, again, even if you're not in a building association but live in a building, going to one of those meetings when you feel safe to do so. I know that we are also in the middle of a pandemic, but raise your hand, say, I live here. If you want to say you have COPD, you can, and ask about how they're working to address concerns in the face of climate change. Ask about what protections are in the environment. Ask about the air filtration system. And they may not have answers right away. They may put it on their agenda, but having them think about this and having them start to understand and raise that to the level where it's a conscious effort is really important. Check in with your doctor, certainly. And check in with your friends and family and make sure that they're all thinking about this as well and planning and preparing ahead and understand where resources are if you are in the know and you know how to use these things. I would also say lean on friends and family who have, if you don't have access to the Air Quality Health Index, if you don't have access to some of these resources, but your family member does or your friend does and so forth, lean on them to try to find out things, okay? We're all in this together. So the BC Lung Association has this really great report that shows a lot of the interventions that are underway and a lot of the things that the BC CDC and the BC Lung Association and the government are trying to do to reduce the impacts of climate change, which is happening now, particularly among individuals who have heightened susceptibility, including folks who are living with COPD. And it's a really informative report, and there's lots of you can go to pieces of it and start to understand more, but I think it's worth, to the degree that you're able to get to this, educating yourself about sort of what's going on out there, and if you want to become involved in making a difference, there's plenty of ways to do so through BC Lung, Legacy for Airway Health, and so forth. So, and that's the end. I'm happy to answer any questions. Sure.
Yeah, I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to withhold them and give the first dibs to the people in the room and then someone online, if there's anyone.
Are you able to put the slide back up for the tax deduction?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, that one, or you want this one?
No, the first one you just had up.
This one?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
I would like to write something down.
Of course.
We bought 3 air purifiers and we put an air conditioner in our house, which was several $1,000s, so this was really important information.
Oh my goodness, get a prescription. Yes. That's one of the requirements, but yeah. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, those can be big investments, so this is very valuable. Any other questions in the room? Are there any online questions waiting?
Okay.
Thanks, Dr. Brigham. Can you speak to the recommendations when there's a high AQHI with mask wearing and what types of masks?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's tricky, and I think that masks are very helpful in filtering out particulate pollution. And we know that particulate pollution, again, remember that picture of the hair and all the different size fractions, contributes a lot to some of the effects that we see. But also within that, within the AQHI, there's different gases and so forth, which we're not sure the masks are as able to filter out. So there's some concern with just wearing masks and still going about your daily activities outdoors, that there could be a false sense of security. So the best place to be is ideally, if you can, in an indoor environment where there's air filtration and you're reducing exposures around you. But masks in general, we've learned so much during the COVID-19 pandemic, and thankfully N95s are available to much more of the population. We know that a simple cloth face mask may not actually do that much. Double layering the mask does more if you're in that situation, but an N95, a well-fitting N95, is probably the best protection against particulate pollution if you have to go outdoors. But the recommendation is really to try to limit your time outdoors to the degree that it's safe to do so. And in an area where there's air filtration. There are clean air shelters that get set up too for individuals who can't maintain those clean air areas within their homes. Sometimes what we try to do is in advance think about where those places may be. So shopping malls, thinking about libraries and so forth, places where you can go. And then another aspect that I wanted to mention too is that a lot of times these events, or often these events, co-occur with extreme heat episodes. And so there's some, oftentimes it's difficult to know whether to open your windows or close your windows, right? We're trying to keep the air pollution outside, but it's really hot inside. The current thinking is that oftentimes extreme heat and the heat in the indoor environment can be more detrimental. And so in an acute setting where it's getting really hot outside, but there's wildfire smoke outside, it's probably to your benefit to actually just open up the windows and then try to get somewhere safe to get the temperature down. But it's tough, it's tricky. So we're trying with this. A lot of this is personalized recommendations with your doctor. And that's why we're trying to create this tool to really help with some of that messaging and so forth on an individual basis. I hope that I answered a lot more than masks. So thank you for asking that.
Thank you, Jenna. Anyone else have questions for Dr. Brigham? Okay, we've got a couple minutes, so I'm going to ask one question, and then since we do have a few minutes, if anyone still has any questions for Dr. Whitman, we could probably fit in another question after this as well, and then we'll break for lunch. But yeah, Emily, thank you for that. I wanted to go back to your talk about diet, and I know you talked about being underweight or overweight as, risk factors for exacerbations, and also issues around, sometimes with COPD having difficulty eating or leading to symptoms. So is there anything in the guidelines around losing weight or gaining weight and how that interacts with people who might have COPD?
Yeah, so I won't try to pull all that up again and so forth, but some of the guideline recommendations are really to maintain a healthy weight, which is really considered to be a BMI between 20 and 25. And, there's considerations on either side for that. But with the idea that if you're within that healthy weight, there's a chance that you're getting enough nutrition, that you're getting enough sort of energy in your daily diet, and that you may not be experiencing some of the effects that increased weight can cause, which are perhaps more difficulty expanding the chest cavity. We know that there are other potential morbidity factors that are related to extremes of obesity and so forth. And so 20 to 25 is what's recommended.
Thank you so much. I know, and the losing weight, gaining weight, it's never an easy,
so tricky
question or process for anyone.
I do think, too, one thing to add on to that, if you find that you are losing weight or gaining weight and it's unintentional, you're not trying to do that, that's an indicator in patients with COPD to go and see your doctor, because something has changed, and it may be that something has changed within your lungs, and it's important to go get that checked out.
Thank you. And then another question that was passed on to me, and this might be actually for either of you, for Dr. Whitman or Dr. Brigham, about milk and dairy products. And I know a lot of people have concerns about drinking milk and concerns about it creating mucus or causing people to cough. And obviously that's a concern with COPD, and wondering if either of you, can shed some light on that question.
Yeah. I'd love to hear what Dr. Whitman tells her patients. I can tell you what I say. It's individual. I think the studies are all over the map as to whether dairy always contributes to more mucus. I would say it's a balance. If you find that when you're eating more dairy, you're getting more mucus, you can try going off of dairy for a bit. But pay really close attention to making sure you're getting enough calcium and vitamin D. Vitamin D, partly for the reasons that I was talking about, where there may be some signal that in folks who are insufficient and have frequent exacerbations that vitamin D may be helpful. So I'd prefer not to get deficient. Also, we think about other things like bone health and osteoporosis, so vitamin D is really important in terms of that. But I wouldn't say anything blanket about just going off dairy. And if you do decide to move away from dairy, make sure that you're still getting calcium, vitamin D, and protein at adequate levels within your diet. Dr. Whitman, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
I really don't have anything to add to that excellent answer.
Oh, thank you. It's a great question. Everybody asked that, though. I'm glad. It's coming up in conversation.
Thank you. If there's no other questions, we will break for lunch. And I think